One of the things I think strikes you every time you look at Connolly is he's one of these historical figures who refuses to remain historical, refuses to remain in the past. Even if you were trying to read his work in a kind of a purely historical sense with no influence on what's going on today, it doesn't happen because it keeps cropping up. I think a good example of this is exactly a century ago Connolly was handing out a leaflet which contained the words, "Fellow workers, stand by the dignity of your class. All these parading royalties, all this insolent aristocracy, all these grovelling, dirt-eating capitalist traitors, all these are the signs of disease in any social state, diseases which a royal visit brings to a head and spews in all its nastiness before our horrified eyes." You can hand that leaflet out today unchanged because of course the impending royal presence which is about to be foisted upon us. I kind of get the impression most people have had sort of negative feelings in the room towards the royal visit, but on the other hand there are those who say that this lady should be given the same welcome in Ireland that Irish people have traditionally been given in Britain, which presumably means that at the airport she should be arrested and held in prison. Something she didn't do. Yeah, well, I mean, for something she didn't do, but it'd be difficult to put her in prison for something she did do because she doesn't do anything. I still have my suspicions that the visit is linked to the government crackdown on social welfare fraud, you know? A woman who for 80 years had lived on state benefits. But I mean, what Connolly was about was ridding the world of kings and queens, not just the ones with crowns on their heads, but the kind of economic kings and queens who ran the world in his day and still do today. And for that reason, people who've tried to carry on that aim have been inspired by him and by his work. And what we're talking about today is specifically how far he influenced Republicans. And the kind of the generation or so after Connolly's execution is the bit I'm dealing with. And what you see generally is that Connolly features a lot in Republican discussion of the time, in articles and speeches and so on. More often than not, though, it tends to be a reference to the name rather than any kind of engagement with Connolly's work. And often it's Connolly being mentioned to sort of back up a position someone already holds, rather than engaging with Connolly's work and trying to understand what he was saying and maybe changing your own point of view in relation to that. It tends to be people who have their own position and kind of throw in, as Connolly said, to back it up. You often see Connolly being mentioned on a list along with other historical figures, Pearse and Connolly, Pearse, Plunkett and Connolly, Tone and Connolly, Lawler, Mitchell, you name it, they tend to come in on a list along with Connolly. And not often the only thing that kind of unites the people on that list is that they fought for Irish independence, which kind of narrows down Connolly's politics to just one aspect of it. Often Connolly appears when some kind of social injustice is being mentioned by Republicans. But ironically enough, instead of that being a way of developing some kind of political solution to these problems, it kind of becomes the opposite. It kind of becomes an obstacle to that. So for instance, if Republicans are talking about, for the sake of argument, slum housing in Dublin, a reference to Connolly and Connolly's opposition to this kind of thing can often serve to allow Republicans to say, well, we're already okay on this. Connolly is one of ours. He's talked about this kind of thing, so we're sorted. We don't need to go into it any further. Whereas an actual engagement with Connolly's work would see that it's not enough to say that. It's not enough to say that slums will go when Ireland is free. You need to actually talk about what kind of social and political changes are needed to abolish landlordism, to provide housing on the basis of social need rather than how much money you have in your pocket and so on. And that these kind of shortcomings in Republican discussion of Connolly are by no means limited just to the Republican movement. You'll find in much of the discussion of Connolly elsewhere amongst the Labour movement, the Labour Party, and in the Marxist tradition in its various strands, it's quite common. And one of the reasons of that was that it was very difficult to engage with Connolly's work at a time when so little of it was available. If you take, for the sake of argument, someone who became politically involved quite soon after Connolly's execution and was a great admirer of Connolly and got hold of every book and every pamphlet of Connolly's works that was published in those time, they would have a very small amount of Connolly's writings available to them. They'd have, you know, the sort of the major pamphlets, the Labour and Irish History and Reconquest of Ireland and Labour, Nationality and Religion, but a whole swathe of Connolly's writings just would not be available to them, which obviously makes it difficult to understand exactly where Connolly was coming from when you're just dealing with a part of the picture. Also, it's very interesting to see what wasn't available. If this person, I'm imagining, who got all these books and pamphlets, they would have an article in amongst those lot which Connolly wrote, which was published on the 30th of April 1914. Nothing after that. Nothing from the last 2 years of Connolly's life would be available to the general reader. Now, at the risk of stating the obvious, this is a fairly crucial period in Connolly's life. This is the period when the war broke out, when the socialist movement internationally all but collapsed. And how Connolly came to terms with that, how week to week he tried to grapple with the problems that threw up, how he eventually came to fight in the Easter Rising. This is something that people would not be able to read for themselves. And that kind of situation, that's how rumours get started. People can kind of spin any myth they like about Connolly's last couple of years. So it's possible for people to say, or even not necessarily say, but kind of imply that Connolly, he said a lot of stuff about socialism, but in the last few years he changed his mind. In the end, he just died for Ireland. He stopped being a socialist and just became a straightforward nationalist. And you find people from the left and right saying that at this time. Another noticeable thing as well, absent from the writings that were available, was most of the stuff Connolly wrote about the North. When he was in Belfast between 1911 and 14, he was having to deal with the realities of Northern politics and Northern history, the development of sectarianism, why it was that the most industrially developed city in the country had the most divided working class rather than the most united. Hardly any of this was available, was published for people to read. And so the first generation of Republicans who had to deal with the reality of partition, not just with the British state, but also the states that Britain had established in Stormont and in Dublin, they were doing that without the benefit of Connolly's analysis. So in these kind of situations, it's understandable to some degree how it was difficult for people to come to terms with what Connolly had to say and to use that to guide them in their work. It should be said in passing that the situation isn't, while it's much improved, it's not by any means solved. There's still a huge amount of Connolly's work unavailable to the general reader. And I think the absence of Connolly's work, the absence of any real kind of serious political influence, is evident even when the Republican movement shifts to the left in this period. If you look at Saor Éire in 1931, which today's event is named after, it was launched by the IRA in 1931 and was a fairly openly socialist initiative. The manifesto of Saor Éire was quite clear in saying that their ideal was to achieve a freely functioning Irish Republic and the organisation of a worker state. Fairly kind of radical stuff. But the interesting thing is, I think you can even see in the language, the absence of Connolly. In that manifesto or in Saor Éire's work generally, Connolly isn't quoted, which is quite strange. Even the fact that they use the phrase a workers' state rather than a workers' republic. I think for a couple of reasons workers' republic is a better phrase than workers' state, but it could well mean the same thing. But it's very strange given Connolly's, how well known Connolly was, that they didn't mention him and they didn't draw on his tradition. I think it kind of is evidence that Saor Éire owed its inspiration not so much to Connolly but to other strands. At this time you'd see a fair number of people in the IRA leadership who were sympathetic to Communist Party and communist politics internationally. And in the 30s a lot of people had sympathy for Russia, many of them for very genuine reasons, imagining that socialism was being realised in Russia, and it wasn't always their fault that they were unaware that the opposite was the case. But there were also people, I think, whose attraction to Russia was not so much a political or ideological one, or a left-wing one even, but that Russia was a large and powerful state. And you'll find people in the IRA leadership of the 20s and 30s who are not at all left-wing, but are kind of attracted by Russia. Some for the straightforward reason that they think they might be able to get a few guns off of Stalin. but you'll find people involved in kind of international peasant committees and world workers' relief organisations and kind of things, which are largely organised by the Communist International. And I think a large part of the inspiration for the shift towards Saor Éire arose from that. That's obvious as well, I think, when you look at some of the people who were prominent in it. One of the most prominent speakers around the time of Saor Éire was Sean MacBride, who was, you know, a figure in the IRA leadership throughout the 30s. And in 1931 you hear him coming out with some shocking left-wing language altogether, which he never had done before and never did afterwards. I mean, even, you know, going into the 40s and Clon the Poblacht, you'll find he was in favour of social reform, but nothing that would offend the sort of bastions of privilege, as people like Noel Brown found out to their cost. But at this time, MacBride is talking very left-wing talk. And I think it's difficult to avoid the impression that what happened was people who weren't necessarily politically convinced of socialism or anything like that themselves had just decided, well, this is what we're going to do, this is the party line that we're going to put forward, and they're arguing accordingly. I think as well you need to look at the reality that the Republican movement was facing something of a crisis throughout this period. There'd been, of course, obviously the heavy defeat of the Civil War, the defection of De Valera and co. in the mid-20s, and the most annoying thing of all, the very successful defection, the fact that they brought most of their support with them. And the IRA at this time were trying new things, and this was something they tried. The evidence of it seems to suggest, though, that it was largely a top-down initiative, that the IRA leadership announced that Saor Éire suddenly existed, and a lot of rank-and-file IRA volunteers were not necessarily convinced of the thing. This is often a problem with a political movement which is organised purely on the basis of winning Irish independence, with quite divergent views about what happens after that. When people try and shift it, it can often be difficult. But there were many IRA volunteers at the time who were kind of bemused by Saor Éire, not really involved in it. Some were actively opposed and thought it was something that would divert them from their central goal. And I think the thing that I think underlines more than any other how superficial a shift to the left Saor Éire was, is that it disappeared as quickly as it came. As soon as it was set up, there was a coordinated church and state offensive against it. The bishops read a pastoral in every church in the country saying it was sinful and irreligious to be involved in Saor Éire. The government then banned the organisation, launched a big roundup of Republicans, arresting loads of them and banning their newspapers and so on. The IRA leadership then dropped Saor Éire like the proverbial hot potato. As soon as it came, it went. It wasn't something that it wasn't a political shift that had been argued for and won and convinced of. It was something they brought in and something they hushed up very quickly when it proved to be difficult. And I think the lack of Connolly's influence on Saor Éire kind of as well is part of the sort of artificial nature of it. Now, I think there's a very different story with what happened 3 years later with the Republican Congress. Often the Republican Congress and Saor Éire are kind of linked together, but I think the more you look at them, you see they're miles apart. The Republican Congress is just in a different league to Saor Éire, a much more serious and a much more interesting attempt. Now, the left-wing figures in the IRA leadership had argued that the IRA should organise a Republican Congress. Pat O'Donnell is the most well-known one of them. They put down a motion at that year's, the 1934 convention of the IRA, and won a good deal of support. Apparently a majority of IRA volunteers supported the idea, but the votes of the leadership prevented them. So they left the IRA and set up the Republican Congress. And they held a conference in Athlone in April of that year. And you can see something quite different from the manifesto they issued after that conference, the way it begins. This is the first paragraph of it. "We believe that a Republic of a United Ireland will never be achieved except through a struggle which uproots capitalism on its way." And then there's a quotation. "We cannot conceive of a free Ireland with a subject working class. We cannot conceive of a subject Ireland with a free working class. This teaching of Connolly represents the deepest instinct of the oppressed Irish nation." So you have a quotation from Connolly right there, front and centre, when the Republican Congress announces itself to the world. And that quotation itself is quite interesting, because it's not even today one of your well-known Connolly quotes. It's not from one of the sort of most well-known of Connolly's works, any of his major books and pamphlets. It's from an article which was published in the Workers' Republic on the 18th of December 1915, and therefore hadn't been available, wasn't published in any of the books or pamphlets that had come out. So whoever put it in had done some serious research into Connolly's work, some proper digging amongst his writings to come up with it. This might have something to do with the fact that the first signatory to that manifesto was Nora Connolly, James Connolly's daughter. But I have a feeling myself that it has something to do with the second signatory, who was a man called Michael Price, who is one of these sorely neglected figures in left-wing history. Often when people talk about the IRA left in the 30s, they talk about O'Donnell and Frank Ryan and George Gilmore. They don't talk so much about Michael Price, and I think they should, because I think he's as important as any of them. He'd actually undergone something of a political shift. At the time of Saor Éire, he was opposed to it. He didn't think this was a good idea, it was too left-wing. He wasn't a socialist at all at that stage. He believed in an idea called distributism, which was quite common in the IRA in the 30s, which didn't want to abolish private property but distribute it a bit more fairly. I mean, I don't know if anyone's interested in going into the details afterwards, we can do. I won't be offended if you don't want to. But by 1934, he changed. He'd undergone a kind of a conversion, a kind of road to Damascus type conversion, and I think it's clear, looking at the evidence, that reading Connolly had a huge effect on that. Michael Price put down a motion at that IRA convention before the motion on the Republican Congress, where he said that the IRA should redeclare our allegiance to the Republic of Ireland based upon production and distribution for use and not for profit, in which the exploitation of the labour of human beings with all its attendant miseries and insecurity shall not be tolerated, and that the IRA would publicly announce it would never disband until that kind of a republic had been achieved. Didn't win support at the convention. People tried to rule out of order. Even O'Donnell and the supporters of the Republican Congress thought it was too far to the left. So Price said, OK, grand, dropped it, walked out of the convention, walked out of the IRA, and re-established an Irish citizen army in an attempt to reform the force that Connolly had led a couple of decades before. And Price became one of the organisers of the Republican Congress, a member of his organising bureau. And as I say, it might well be his influence that made Connolly so central to it, or at least in some part. You can see in the speech he gave in the early days of trying to organise the Congress, he was explaining why some people would be invited and some wouldn't. Fianna Fáil wouldn't be invited, he said, for obvious reasons. The leadership of Labour wouldn't be invited, he said, because the Irish Labour Party betrayed the Connolly teaching and tradition in 1922, and its stand on the Republican issue today is not at all an amend for that betrayal. Again, the fact that Connolly is being betrayed is the main indictment he has against him. He says that the IRA leadership is being invited because we believe they should be forced to face a Congress of Republicans to say why they should not pledge themselves not to disband the IRA until the unity and freedom of an Irish Republic based upon the organisations of society visualised for Free Ireland by Connolly has been achieved. Again, the motion he put down is still something that rankles with him. He still thinks is very important. That was the aim to be that people should aspire to. And again, it's the Ireland envisaged by Connolly that's driving it. He goes on to talk about how the Congress would address specifically the problems faced by women workers, and quotes some of the things that Connolly wrote about the oppression of women. It's very central to his motivation that Connolly's politics should be in the middle of all this. And there are a few other things in the work of the Congress which I think re-emphasise how central Connolly's work is. Mar hapla bhí go leor obair de chógáil in Éirígí, cé nach bhfuil mór an cainte ar luchstara. Ach dógur pápéir na cógála ag cuinte áirid. Gomach siad feidsiú scríbhní chaníla nó aistrú gaige scríbhní chaníla, agus an chóise bhíle seaúir siad, bhí siad a ghaíanna rún ólas na scríbhní sin a chur fáil de gaidúirí. Sé sin rún réalt ólas chlí na saoirse a thiorsa. Sinna bhí scríbhní chaníla dar leis a gógáil, réalt ólas chlí na saoirse. A guiding star on the way to freedom. That's the kind of the importance that Connolly's writings had in the Republican Congress. If you look at one of the most famous events of that year, the Bodenstown commemoration of 1934, when you had a large contingent of Protestant workers from Belfast who were supporters of the Congress, one of the banners they carried had the message, "Unto the Workers' Republic," Connolly's message, "Our Ideal." And one of the reasons behind the support that Congress had won in the North amongst Protestant workers, which is still, you know, a fairly phenomenal achievement, is that Connolly's message was their ideal. The idea of a workers' republic was something that appealed to them. And branches of Congress in Belfast called themselves James Connolly clubs to underline that. Now the terrible thing about the Congress is, of course, that it all ends in tears. The famous Brendan Behan joke about the first item on the agenda is the split. That was literally true in the case of Republican Congress. They met in September of '34 and were split down the middle between those who said, 2 minutes left, Jesus. That's not what they said. Between those who said that they should continue to have the objective of a workers' republic, and those who said it should just be an Irish republic without being specific. Now, I think, to cut a long story short, this isn't sort of a meeting on the Republican Congress. I think the minority who stuck with the idea of the workers' republic, I think, carried on what was good in the Republican Congress. And when they lost the argument, I think most of the steam went out of Congress. It was a shadow of his former self. In the discussion there, you'll find that Connolly's work was also central to that. People arguing what Connolly would have said. Nora Connolly quoting how important the workers' republic was, especially in Britain, having an appeal to Protestant workers in the North. I'll just quote what Michael Price said at that conference, which kind of underlines some of the points he was making. We of the Republican movement and of the working class movement must insist that the declaration from this Congress must be of a militant working class nature, which will write upon the skyline the real conception, the James Connolly conception of the Republic. Again, this is something personal for him. He prepared to walk out on the IRA when it hadn't committed itself to Connolly and the Workers' Republic. He's prepared to do the same with Republican Congress. Connolly's idea is central to driving the Republican Congress. Kind of jump ahead a bit. I think what happens to Price and Nora Connolly and other people who were in the minority of the Congress afterwards kind of underlines the atmosphere of the time. They joined the Irish Labour Party and were quite successful in pushing it to the left. It's amazing looking at today's Labour Party how left-wing it was at the time in the late 30s and 40s. In 1936 they succeeded in getting the Labour Party to adopt as its objective the creation of a workers' republic in Ireland, which was a big deal, especially when you consider today they had the objective of creating a bankers' republic in Ireland. But within a year, that had to be dropped. The Catholic hierarchy got in touch with Labour and said, we don't like this phrase. And very quickly it was dropped. Now, if you can't talk about the workers' republic, you can't really talk about Connolly. The kind of political atmosphere was very suffocating and made it very difficult for people to put forward Connolly's ideas. Even when it wasn't just his ideas, but even just his image. Marcian O'Kyan, who was a leading Republican in Galway in the 30s, was a national teacher. He put up a picture of Connolly on the classroom wall, along with other kind of national heroes. O'Kyan wasn't involved in the Congress or anything. But his parish priest came in and said, take down that picture, that man's a communist. If you can't even put up a picture of Connolly, it's very difficult to talk about discussing his politics, and very difficult for his politics to have an influence on how people work. So that was a situation which I think didn't really change. I mean, it's largely the case in the 40s and 50s that kind of continued, and it's only really in the 60s, which I think Brian will be dealing with, that sort of changes. So just to sum up a few things, I think when you see that Connolly's politics are kind of one strand in a kind of a broad, all-encompassing movement of Republicans who were united only by the desire for independence, it's their jostling other opinions and not necessarily being successful. When people are seriously organising on a different basis of saying what kind of republic, that it should be a workers' republic, which is socialist, which is the politics of Connolly, then it comes front and centre. And I think in our own day, that's when Connolly's politics can do the same and translate from the page onto the streets and the workplace and the struggle. And I think it's only on that basis really that we'll be able to confront the kind of problems that capitalism is presenting us with in Ireland and beyond. I'll leave it there for now. So thanks.